Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have James Broughel. He's a senior research fellow with the Mercatus Center, and he works on, regulations.
Regulations,
right? And namely, I would say over-regulations, right? I had to deal with these things, yeah. And so, of course, as we understand, regulations, there's a nice sliding scale between liberty and freedom and complete regulation of society. And of course, governments try to find that nice balance somewhere where they don't trample our rights too much, hopefully, and at the same time make sure people don't abuse the system and whatnot. But what's your approach to this? What's your area of focus?
Well, I like to think that there's a distinction to be made between justified regulations, which serve some public purpose. Maybe they're accomplishing some kind of social goal, like protecting the environment or keeping us safer in our workplaces, and red tape, which is really the unnecessary clutter that just accumulates as we get more and more rules, more and more forms we have to fill out, more paperwork, more compliance burdens. And so it's really red tape that we want to address, which can be a problem, but the justified regulations can make sense.
And this is an important topic, I think, with millennials especially people who've kind of gone towards the ideas of socialism and things like this. They believe that government is the grand protector against corporate oligarchy and these types of things, but they don't realize sometimes that the overregulation is often what creates oligarchy. That it is what makes it so medium-sized businesses can't compete because of regulations, because they can't afford, say, paying for the people to come in and do tests and people to come in and, for example, like if you want to develop land or something like that, you have to pay people to come and check for environmental issues and things like this. It's hard to pay for that unless you're a big company. And so what you have the big companies that stay in business, and that's about it, the extreme end of that.
There's a well-documented phenomenon in the economics literature called regulatory capture. And this is the idea that the regulatory agencies who are supposed to be acting in the public interest, looking out for the little guy, for the ordinary citizen, can get captured by the entities, or often businesses that they're tasked with regulating, and end up serving their interests rather than the public interest. And to some extent, this is kind of a natural phenomenon. The regulatory agencies rely on the business community for a lot of information. The business community has the legal standing to challenge their regulations and sue them in court. And so they really need to get buy-in from the business community. But that means that sometimes the regulations we get are really more about catering to business or protecting big business and keeping out smaller competitors from entering their industry, and not so much looking out for the public interest.
Yeah, which is ironic because that is the formula for oligarchy, as we just discussed, and it's often framed as a way to fight against big business, right? We're going to regulate this industry to stop these big wigs from dominating your markets, but in reality, it's doing exactly what it claims to be stopping from happening.
There was a great quote from Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase. And he once described regulation as a moat that protected his business. And what he meant by that is it's this barrier that keeps out other people from encroaching on the territory of his bank. I thought that was a really great metaphor.
It's very interesting. And now we were talking a bit off camera about how regulations are written, and people might not really understand how they're written. Could you explain that
Sure.
a bit?
So a lot of people actually don't fully understand this whole process, but we know that when we go to vote on election day, we vote for legislators, either our local representatives or representatives in Congress or the president, and that those representatives write laws. But it turns out that the laws that our elected representatives write often leave a lot of details out. There's kind of tough political decisions that representatives don't really want to make. And so they leave those decisions to regulators, to unelected public officials who then have the right to write regulations, or sometimes called administrative law, which has just as much the force of law as the laws that our elected representatives write, except they're written by unelected public sector officials. And so increasingly, more and more of the actual law that gets written in the United States, especially at the federal level, is written through regulation, through administrative law, as opposed to through our elected representatives.
And that's really bizarre. I think I'm sure that would come as a shock to some people, right?
It's definitely not very democratic. Now, some people say that these regulators have more expertise. Maybe our elected representatives don't have enough time or aren't educated enough about certain complicated topics that we need these experts to be writing all these regulations. But there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between expertise and democratic accountability. And it's hard to know what the right balance is.
And also the risk of financial incentive behind that as well. That it could be a formula for corruption in some ways.
There's absolutely a revolving door that goes on in a lot of these regulatory agencies between, like at the Securities and Exchange Commission, people go work there, then they go and get a high-paying job at a bank, or people go work for lobbyists and things like that. So it's certainly a problem.
And then on top of it, you have to remember a lot of politicians are getting, they get a lot of money from these big companies. A lot of their campaign finances come from these big businesses and things like that. Both sides of the aisle. This is not a partisan thing. But I think people would do well to reflect on, especially when you have, these millionaires and billionaires, as I think Bernie Sanders called them, advocating for socialism. Why would they advocate for socialism? Why would they advocate for the government, creating mass regulations? I think it's because they know that in the long run, it's the biggest businesses that will benefit from it, right? As often happens.
There's certainly a disturbing trend that there's been less dynamism in the American economy, fewer startups, fewer firm deaths as well. Like businesses aren't. There's as much churn of new firms being created, old firms going away as there used to be. Economic growth has slowed down relative to the second half of the 20th century, and all of this has been accompanied by a rising level of regulation across the country. We've seen just the amount of regulation just increasing year after year after year, so one has to wonder if the two are related.
And another interesting point in regards to this is that the Trump administration has been focused on cutting regulations. And I think a lot of the media has been trying to frame this as Trump, helping out big business and this type of thing. But based on what you're telling me, this isn't really the case sometimes, right?
Well, I think that the Trump administration has had a lot of success at rolling back some of the regulations that were issued at the tail end of the Obama administration. And I think one of the reasons they've focused on those regulations may be because those are the regulations that the business community wants to see gone. The business community tends to not like new regulations that they have to comply with, that they haven't complied with yet. But once the regulations are in place, and they've already spent some resources to comply with them, they tend to like keeping them there because it acts as a barrier to new competitors. And so one of the challenges with any reform, like the Trump administration's reform that's trying to reduce regulatory burdens, is identifying all those old regulations that maybe don't make sense anymore, they're outdated, they're duplicative, but that the business community might actually be resistant to getting rid of just because they've already spent the resources to comply.
Well, and that makes sense too. Sometimes there could be so many regulations that you could violate the law and not even know you're in violation of the law, unless you have a whole lot of money to spend, like you said, hiring lawyers to go and research all that to make sure you're in compliance, and then having inspectors go out and compliance officers and these types of things go out. That you need a lot of money for that type of work.
So we have a project at the Mercatus Center where we're measuring the amount of regulatory requirements that exist in a code. We're using computers to do this because reading through the entire code of federal regulations would take 3 years. And we've found that there are almost 1.1 million restrictive terms in the Code of Federal Regulations. That's just the federal code. So there's state regulations that are a layer on top of that, local regulations that are a layer on top of that. With all of these requirements in place, it seems impossible that we're not violating some regulation at one time or another in our lives. And the real danger that that creates is that we'll just get selective enforcement from the people in power. They can target maybe the company that they don't like for political reasons and go after them because they know everybody's violating some law.
And we've seen that. I mean, maybe not all the time, but we have seen that. Where, you know, sometimes companies or individuals, they'll get a slap on the wrist punishment, and then some people who maybe for political interests, they get, you know, a real serious prison sentence. And then they have, you know, fall guys sometimes who take all the blame, and, you know, it's a mess. And you're right that it does create, maybe my interpretation, it creates a formula for corruption if you're not careful. And it creates a formula where, you know, individuals you can't get involved in a company without violating the law in some way, and so you have to play another game, so to speak, to play business.
We want a simple, level playing field that's fair to everyone. And the more complicated the regulatory system is, the more of an advantage it is to insiders and to big business with the resources to hire the attorneys and the accountants and compliance officers to make sense of all this tangled web of rules.
And I guess just, you know, last point is, you know, in terms of maybe more philosophical, I guess, but in terms of your own work and this project itself, what was the motivation? What was the issue that was seen that made you want to start this or get involved in this?
Well, when I moved to the Washington, D.C. area in 2011, and I started in kind of an entry-level role at the Mercatus Center, and I really knew nothing about regulation at that time. And I was just stunned to learn that this is basically how policy gets made in Washington. The U.S. Senate barely even passes laws anymore. They confirm judges sometimes, but that's about it. No new laws get through the House and the Senate. And so our legislators spend more time giving speeches than actually crafting policy. But that doesn't mean there isn't law being made. It's just not coming from our elected representatives. It's coming from these unelected bodies in the executive branch. I was stunned by that, and I wanted to better understand what the consequences of that were. And so that is really a motivating force behind my research.
And that's interesting too. That the idea that there is an unelected system that is basically creating the society in which we live, right?
And it's kind of permanent and ongoing. Presidents come and go. The political team that comes in place with them come and go. But the regulators themselves just stay on at these agencies for years and years and years.
Jeez. So where can people learn more about your work?
You can go to mercatus.org. If you go to quantgov.org, you can see some of the projects where we're trying to quantify regulation and measure how much regulation there is at the federal government and in the states. And my name's James Broughel. If you Google my name, you'll probably find some of my research.
Great. A real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.